We have been studying in Sri Aurobindo's Synthesis of Yoga the chapter titled The Soul and Its Liberation. In the last four paragraphs, or rather in the first four paragraphs that we have read so far, in each we saw a perspective and approach of the one Satchidananda. It's as if the Satchidananda looks at itself in this way, and in that way, and in another way, and still another way. And in the fifth paragraph that we will take up today, it is another perspective of the Satchidananda. In the experiential journey of this chapter, it is always the oneness that has predominated, which was seen in the previous two chapters, in the chapter called Oneness and subsequently in the chapter called The Soul and Nature. We saw the one Satchidananda taking this double poise of soul and nature, of Sat as existence, and then Chit, consciousness and power of consciousness, which is nature. The Prakriti, the movement of nature, forming, creating, has two aspects. There is this aspect where she is pouring out all powers of knowledge, will, delight, self-expression, all variations, inversions, conversions, conservations, even perversions. All these are being played out. We see and know this as the world and as nature. And behind all this play, behind all these extremes, is the same power knowing herself in all these movements, but holding equally every movement, supporting every extreme of size, the grain of sand and the galaxy equally supported, supporting every force, a force that moves this way and a force that moves the opposite way, heading for a collision, are both equally supported by the same power, by the same energy. And every variation is held in the same force, in equal unity, supporting the whole play impartially, and therefore in her consciousness utterly in equilibrium. At no point is she exaggerated on one side or the other, or biased in one sense or another. And this is still nature. She is pouring out, she is directing all these energies. But the poise here is where she knows her unity and holds all these movements and guides them from a position of mastery. So he says, governs even as it has originated the variations and directs them to whatever aim of its self-delight the being, the Purusha, has conceived in its consciousness and determined by its will or power of consciousness. And so at this point, this larger, complete nature, which he now calls higher or divine nature, is looking at her consciousness of Purusha, the Sat, and what it conceives of itself. She draws out that sense and executes, fulfills the purpose of his intention, of his delight. Down to the tiniest detail she forms until she creates and expresses him in and through the flower. And as she fulfills him in the flower, she also fulfills him in the bee. She also fulfills him in the tree, as in the mountain, as in the planet, as in the galaxy, as in the totality of the whole universe. And so this poise of nature is extremely important now for us to recognize as different from the surface movement of nature that we are familiar with, where we do not see the underlying oneness. We see flower, we see bee, and we see tree, and we see some relationship between them. Sometimes the relationship is of conflict, as the goat comes to eat the flower and tears its petals, or a human comes and cuts the flower and places it elsewhere. But always to her consciousness in divine nature, it is herself fulfilling through all these forms what he, as the divine being, Purusha, has conceived and wishes to enjoy, and she fulfills it. So we see something very important here. There is the divine Purusha, there is the divine nature, and then there is the movement of divine nature as she flows into all the details where we no more see the divinity or the underlying equality which supports in oneness impartially. We see now only separateness and tensions and conflicts and play of separateness, which we will now call lower nature. But supporting behind is always the divine nature. And the divine nature knows always the Purusha. She is one with the Purusha even as she executes his will and his delight. So that is the divine nature into unity with which we have to get back by our yoga of self-knowledge. What do we become when we know the divine nature? We have to become the Purusha, Satchidananda, delighting in a divine individual possession of its Prakriti, and no longer mental beings subject to our egoistic nature. So our consciousness, as it rises to become conscious of this divine nature, our consciousness also joins with the Purusha. But he names it now the Purusha with a capital P, the Purusha Satchidananda. That is, it lives in the consciousness of Satchidananda, in this underlying oneness, and not in the fragmented piece that was the mental little ego earlier. So something very important is implied here. As our consciousness is liberated from the ego and it rises more and more into this sense of the oneness of Satchidananda, we also discover nature in her larger, clearer and diviner working, equally supporting all things, free in her divinity, as our own power now, our own consciousness pouring out to express this nature. Now this ascent is taking place not in the cosmos, but in the individual. I am experiencing my consciousness now as it rises beyond the mind and awakens to Satchidananda. I begin to see my nature, which earlier I felt separate, cut off from the flower. I begin to experience that as my hand holds the flower, it is the same energy, the same consciousness in the flower as in the hand. As I look at the flower at a distance on the tree, I experience the same energy that is tree, the same consciousness that is tree and flower. And increasingly, as my consciousness rises into Satchidananda, I experience my nature as an expression of my own liberated consciousness. How far does it go? As far as I choose to experience myself one with nature. I am already one with the whole of nature, in the infinity, in the oneness, but in my personal sense of action, I have a range which is my sense of participation in the whole. And yet I am conscious of the whole. I am conscious of the flower as myself in another form, and I center myself in this individual through which I gaze upon the flower and reach out to touch, to cut, and to take myself in another form. But always I am conscious that it is my own consciousness, my own energy, equally supporting the flower as it supports this individual center that I call me. So as the individual rises to become Purusha Satchidananda, delighting in a divine individual possession of its Prakriti, this play becomes now revealed and fully conscious. And then Sri Aurobindo highlights, and this is the theme of this paragraph that we read last time, the importance of this individual play in the with the liberated nature, with the divine nature. So the divine individual and the divine nature playing in the consciousness which is liberated in Satchidananda. No longer mental beings subject to our egoistic nature, for that is the real man, the supreme and integral self of the individual. And the ego is only a lower and partial manifestation of ourselves through which a certain limited and preparatory experience becomes possible and is for a time indulged. If you wish to meet a fish that lives in water, you cannot meet it from your consciousness being in the air. It cannot know you. It can only glimpse you in a distant image that refracts through the water. You have to project a part of yourself into the water. Place your hand in the water that the fish can meet you. And that's the sense of the ego consciousness put out as a projection, a focal point through which one can engage in a kind of a narrow, limited play for a while. He uses the word for a time indulged. But this indulgence of the lower being is not our whole possibility. It is not the sole or crowning experience for which we exist as human beings, even in this material world. Now you could say, at least for the purpose of the play with the fish, I have to put my hand inside the water, and so I have to remain this limited ego point. And he says, even that's not the point. You should be able to get into the water fully. And maybe to push the analogy further, you hold your breath, but you plunge into the water. And now you meet as a whole, complete, divine individual, meet with the fish and experience that world. And the same happens in our physical body, in the physical human experience. It is not a part of us that has to enter to take on the ego center to have the physical experience. Yes, that is a temporary passage, useful for a purpose, and he will now explain what that purpose is. But after that, one has to awaken fully to become Purusha Satchidananda, delighting in a divine individual possession of its Prakriti, even in this material world with a material body. In such an experience, although we would have a material body, although we will act through the material senses and the material limbs, we would not feel ourselves bound to materiality. Even as in our mind we are able to conceive of things which materially we could never experience, so too in our liberated consciousness we would be aware of all of the oneness of Satchidananda, that we are and that the world is, and that is within every single experience. Such a being now in the material body, as he reaches out to hold the flower, will experience flower as Satchidananda, will experience himself also as the same, meeting himself or the same one self in each flower, in each form, in each aspect of the divine. Self-experience, that is, the divine experiences himself as flower and I see him as flower. The divine experiences himself as stone and I enter in relation with him as stone. And everything is lived in that, but not bound merely to the physical consciousness, knowing also all of the deeper underlying realities. Not only seeing the physical form of the flower, but conscious also of the energy form of the flower. Conscious also of the awareness within the energy of the flower. Conscious also of the bliss which is within that awareness in the flower. And everything in the universe experienced in this way. Since you are liberated from the ego, your experience of flower will not be I meeting another little object. It will be I, which is infinite, meeting the object which also has the infinity supporting behind. So every experience will be infinity meeting infinity through finite appearance meeting finite appearance. And if that is the infinity that meets infinity, then the delight of the infinite also will meet the delight of the infinite through the finite points of contact. So as an analogy, when my two fingertips touch, to the molecules there on the surface of the skin, oh, it's just a few molecules meeting a few molecules. But to my liberated consciousness, it is all of me meeting all of me through this front, now through another front, and through another front, and each of my fingers now playing in the multiplicity of delight of the play. And such is the experience of this liberated individual, even as he engages with the whole universe, with all of nature and all beings. So the indulgence of the lower being is not our whole possibility. It is not the sole or crowning experience for which we exist as human beings, even in this material world. But all of this should be possible in the material consciousness. If you were to say that to experience this you have to get out of the body, that the body limits you and the body is incapable of participating in this, that would be an error. Because the divine himself forms matter and through matter enjoys this bliss and delight. And if the divine experiences it, we too are meant to participate in that experience of his delight. So now he has highlighted the importance of the individual and the liberated or divine nature of the divine individual, of which we know in the most surface part the fragmented working of nature in our egoistic consciousness. So when our consciousness is in a mental ego fragmented, we see nature as so many pieces or forces, or one whole formed of so many forces separate from us. As we ascend to the divine individual, we also discover nature in her divine aspect of nature, where the two join. But so the role of this individual now is something very special. We started with as feeling ourselves a piece in all of nature and world. And then there was the divine up there. As we grow into our own divinity, we discover nature also joins with us at the top. So there are, in a sense, three players. And the individual is the one who experiences both this play and that. This individual being of ours, we go into the next paragraph now. This individual being of ours is that by which ignorance is possible to self-conscious mind. But it is also that by which liberation into the spiritual being is possible, and the enjoyment of divine immortality. So there are three things which are possible only for the individual, which are not possible to nature or to the divine consciousness. The first is that we can experience ignorance. The divine consciousness cannot experience ignorance, or it would cease to be divine, isn't it? Nature also, if you look at it as one large movement, you do not see the sense of ignorance, the sense of separateness. At best you may say there is a mechanical nature, there's one gigantic energy pouring around as physics describes it. But you do not see separateness, you do not see a piece cut out that says, I am not all those things. In order to experience that, well, you have to have this sense of an individual. But the individual, where did it come from? If you look at the whole journey of evolution, even in its most superficial way, as science will describe it, somehow in the early mix of chemicals in the original creative soup, there was a formation of molecules that became a cell, or cells clumped together. But where is the individuality? It is still a kind of a vague, universal focus emerging, like a blob. It has not come into its own that can say, I against the rest. It still feels itself bound to and dependent on the soup of the original creative chemical mix. It takes a while to pull out the sense of individuality from that which is universal. So kind of a special focus, building, constructing and hardening sense of separateness, feeling itself more and more cut out, cut away and independent, until it can come into its own reasonably. Even a tree is not so well cut away as an animal. The tree still says, well, if you pull out my roots, I will die. I am still a part of the mountain in some way. But the animal that has evolved can say, I'm going to run away from the mountain, I will dive into the water, I will go to the desert, I am separate, I am free. And that's when the individuality acquires a special character. Even there, you have animals which are quite mixed as group consciousness. Like in the bees, the individuality is at best in the queen bee. And out of that to emerge into each one feeling I am separate. And you see these only in the most evolved animals, where individuality has become strong enough that while there is this collective identity, the individuality can break away. An elephant, for example, although it has a strongly social animal, can walk away on its own and live on its own because it has sufficiently individualized. So the creation of individuality is something so important because it allows this experience of ignorance. I, being separate now, I realize I don't know everything. I have only limited capacity and I have somehow to survive against it all. And so the experience of ignorance is possible. But still the individuality came into its own when the mind formed fully. As long as I was not yet fully mental, I was largely still living in the energy impulse of prana. I was still feeling myself bound to and dependent on my environment or my species or group of tribe or family. When the mind forms fully separate, it can say, I am fundamentally different because I think so differently and I can view everything in my own unique way. And that's why he gives it a very clear formulation. The individual being of ours is that by which ignorance is possible to self-conscious mind. Everything has ignorance. But to self-conscious mind, a mind that is thinking and aware of itself, knows that it is thinking and knows it is ignorant. That is only possible in this individual being. The worm has individuality of a kind, but it does not know that it is ignorant. And for us to become aware that we are ignorant is a first step in our journey to awakening out of ignorance. When the worm does not know it is ignorant, it has no need to try to grow out of ignorance. Interestingly, in the more evolved animals, especially when they come close to human beings, you see in them the recognition that there's something they're missing, that's something they need to have but do not know how to have. The dog looks at the human being and is struggling to understand, why is this fellow doing this strange thing? And he watches minutely when you do strange things, trying to somehow grasp that sense of self-awareness or sense of self-purpose, which is characteristic of the conscious mind. Mother has commented once, when she came back from France, when she came from France, then went to Japan and came back, there were many things she left behind, first in France and then in Japan. But among the things which she carried with her back when she came for good were paintings of monkeys. And someone asked her, why is it you have so many paintings of monkeys? And she said, there's something very special. She said she liked to look at the paintings of monkeys because the sense of aspiration is so strong. They can feel the sense of mind which is as if within reach but not somehow possible to reach. And they're struggling, striving to try to become conscious, to think. And that urge of aspiration, she said that she found to be more intense in the monkey than in human beings. Because in our self-satisfied ignorance, I am already complete. I know everything that I need to. What's the point of growing, progressing, changing, whatever? And so you need a kick from life. Life knocks you and then you realize, oh, I'm not happy with this. I'm fed up with this. I want to break away, get to something more. Something is missing. I'm restless. I am incomplete. I am insufficient. Is there something worthwhile? So the individual is extremely valuable because it allows ignorance in self-conscious mind, which prepares you for the next experience that neither the divine consciousness can have nor nature, which is liberation into the spiritual being that becomes possible. And again, this requires that you have to be separate from the rest if you are to liberate. If you were one with nature, there's no question of liberation because you're always one with the mass and bound to the mass. This is one of the capital mistakes which you will find in a lot of the New Age literature, New Age spirituality and philosophy. You'll find these ideas which go something like, open yourself to the universe, let the universe flow, let the universe lead you, accept whatever the universe gives you. And Sri Aurobindo points out that if you plug yourself into the universality, well, you will always be bound to the universality. What the universe decides for you is the slow evolution, isn't it? Unless you are able to break away from what the universe is deciding for you, how will you grow consciously? And of course, there's a deep truth to it, and the deep truth is, it's not the universe that you have to open to, but to the divine presence which is in the universe. And invoke that presence, the divine will, the divine consciousness, the liberated or divine nature to which you have to connect, not the lower nature, not the inferior mechanical process of the universe. If you do that, well, you will bind yourself into the slow evolution and it will take you a few million years. That's what animals do. That's what the unconscious, unaspiring human lives in. And so to consciously want to plug into that limitation would be an error. You should consciously want to connect to divine nature, or the divine consciousness, or the divine will. And for that you need to be separate from the universe, universal nature. And the individual alone, therefore, can make this conscious progress of awakening to spiritual being. And you see why it is so important to have not one individual, but innumerable individuals, so that each can have its own experience of awakening to spiritual being, and in a unique journey, in a unique way, even a unique experience of its spiritual being. If you had only one reaching spirituality in an individual, necessarily it would be an aspect at first, or only one way in which you could grow into the spiritual being. That for you to experience many different approaches to the divine is also part of the delight, isn't it? To meet, to use the vocabulary of bhakti, to meet the divine beloved through so many disguises, to unveil the divine delight through so many faces and forms, to play at hide and seek in so many robes, in so many settings, in so many cultures, climates, even planets. That would be part of the delight of the play of the hide and seek of soul and nature. Except that for one person to have to go through that would be somewhat pointless. Or rather, for one person to have to go through that would be the one person experiencing himself through many. You see, it's just two different ways of looking at it. It's one person making this journey. It's the same person making that journey. It's the same person making that journey. Or you can say, it is the different individualities which are making different journeys, but all the individuals are really the same one consciousness. You see, it's just two different ways of looking at the same truth. And he comes to this as we proceed in the paragraph. But still, you recognize the importance of individual being necessary not only for the experience of ignorance in self-conscious mind, but also liberation into spiritual being. And in a unique way, a unique manner of experiencing spiritual being is possible only to the individual, not to the divine, not to nature. And then the third thing which is unique is enjoyment of divine immortality. Well, for the divine there is always that immortality. His enjoyment is always of himself in his totality, including all the facets, including all extremes of every experience. It's all already there. So the enjoyment is of a certain type. But here the individual entering into the Satchidananda and knowing himself as all beings and yet experiencing it all from a center allows for an enjoyment of the divine immortality in a sense of an exploration. You can, for example, go on a safari, and here you meet the elephants, there you meet the zebras, and then you meet the monkeys, and you're all meeting different aspects of the divine. In the totality of the divine, all my elephantness, all my zebraness and monkeyness, it's all already there. And when in my totality I concentrate, the divine concentrates, first on elephant, then on zebra, then on monkey, then it's really the divine taking a poise of individuality wandering inside the divinity. You see? But you still need the individuality to be able to enjoy this experience. So I reread this sentence. This individual being of ours is that by which ignorance is possible to self-conscious mind, but it is also that by which liberation into the spiritual being is possible, and the enjoyment of the divine immortality. It is not the eternal in his transcendence or in his cosmic being who arrives at this immortality. It is the individual who rises into self-knowledge. In him it is possessed, and by him it is made effective. Interesting, two aspects. Not only in our individual growth we rise to this self-knowledge, I am the divine, I am one with all, but this self-knowledge is made effective, meaning through this focal point now this experience of self-knowledge begins to act in the universe. And so here comes something very profound, and he throws it just as a suggestion. Not only your consciousness is awakening, but in your consciousness awakening, the whole universe is impacted. Because through this center, the action of the divine awakened consciousness is being applied everywhere. To what limit? Into the whole universe. Because although you are an individual and experiencing yourself separate, you're still part of, in your nature, you're still part of and connected with the rest of the nature. So everything that happens in your awakening consciousness impacts nature, ripples out. So even if one being awakens into divinity, the entire universe is affected. That's why Sri Aurobindo, in one of his very important statements, he says, numbers don't matter. And in Savitri, there's this profound line, one man's perfection can yet save the world. Even if one person is able to achieve this and shift within himself the balance, the whole universe is impacted because you're still a part of the whole. And that's the beauty of the individual. All progress, all evolution in the universe takes place, therefore, through focal points of individual. If the individual does not grow, universe cannot grow. Now look at it from the perspective of the universe. Universe needs to build individual in order to prepare for its own growth and for its own liberation and divinization. So think of it this way now. Reverse the priorities. You thought you are the center of the universe, fighting against the universe. Now look at it The universe thinks of you as the single most important thing that it has been able to build up over billions of years for the purpose of its own divinization. And you're so important to it. In terms of physical size, you may be a tiny dot in the galaxy or the whole universe, but in terms of value that this dot has, it is the most precious substance. Here is a focal point, awakening to liberation into spiritual being and preparing for enjoying of divine immortality, in which the universe will eventually share through not just this one, but eventually through all individuals. So it is through the individual that the individual rises into self-knowledge. In him it is possessed, and by him it is made effective. If you look at the importance of this, taking the example of how effective the human mind is, you will recognize how effective spiritual consciousness will be. The human mind on earth, let's say, having come into a certain form in the last few hundred years. We've always had mind. It has gone through many stages of development. But in the last few hundred years, let's say 200 or 300 years, all over the world there has been this sharp awakening of an individualized rational mind. Sri Aurobindo calls it the age of individualism and reason. So rationality was always there, but it has acquired the character of individuality. And of course, at first it is a more egoistic individuality, and even a physical egoistic individuality. And so its activities are the most materially crude and dominating and short-term in thinking. But still, in the last 300 years, the rapidity with which we have destroyed the whole earth is testament to how powerful the rational mind can be when it is energized on a collective level to short-term satisfaction of desire. It can destroy and consume everything so quickly, change everything so rapidly. If the same intelligence was turned to long-term fulfillment of some ideal, the same earth could have been, as much as it has been damaged, could have grown that much in beauty, in harmony, in the idealism that it wishes to fulfill. Of course, mind would still get frustrated, but it would realize very quickly its own limitation and work to develop higher grades of consciousness and serve it. That would have been the yogic awakening. So we have had to, as a fall, in order to experience the brink of collapse of our own survival, for the ego to awaken to the reality that there is something higher that is now required, and maybe a part of humanity will still continue to fall while another will rise and build. But the power of spirit now awakened will be 100 times more powerful than what rational mind could do. The same rational mind which can get into the genetics of the cell and modify from within is a millionth of what the spiritual consciousness can do, entering the consciousness of the flower behind the genetic and modulating, transforming from within. And so when we think of all the destruction of the earth, the regeneration will be very slow if you follow only mental means, but if a spiritual power is activated, it could rebuild much more rapidly and perhaps heal much more completely. But all of this is only to highlight the power of the rational mind when seized by the short-term ego desire centers all over the world at the same time. And equally the same thing could be so much greater if seized by the spiritual consciousness now. So this importance of made effective is so great. In him it is possessed, and by him it is made effective. Now it broadens the picture. All life, spiritual, mental or material, is the play of the soul with the possibilities of its nature. Think about it this way. Remember in the earlier paragraph, he had spoken of how the unity works out on every plane by this practical duality. So here he is pointing to this again. Spiritual, mental or material life, it's still soul playing its possibilities with its nature. What is material life? When we feel ourselves to be only body. Even my mind is meant to serve only as a mechanism to fulfill the body, because I am just body which is capable of thinking to make itself meaningful. And so, in the body experience, with all of us only bodies, not very different from animals, just thinking animals, it is still the soul playing with possibilities of its nature. Meaning, I want to make my body strong. What am I doing? The soul feels its capacity of strength and now works through the body nature to assert that I wish to make my body strong and healthy. I want to make my body supple. I want to make my body beautiful. I want to make my body conscious and skillful. And in each of these, it is the soul dwelling upon itself saying, I can be this, and then exercising that to express through its nature. Now, depending on the power of the consciousness in which you live, your means are also to that extent limited or greater. So in a physical consciousness, you will say, I have to make my body strong. What do? Eat more, eat healthy, exercise a bit. Because I notice the more I exercise, the stronger the body becomes. As I shift from here, through many levels, into mental consciousness, the same thing continues. There is a still soul and nature. And the soul says, I wish to grow in knowledge. I wish to express deeper insight of knowledge because I see certain relationships, I see numbers, I see persistent truths hiding behind and within numbers. Because wherever I see something which is beautiful, I see these geometric relationships repeated. I try to capture nature's processes, rationalizing through mind and seizing them to make my body life or my mental life more comfortable and effective. And so this penetration through knowledge, seizing the world and nature through knowledge, is still the soul saying, but can I not capture the lightning which is in the sky and make it light up my life? Instead of flashing briefly up there, to have the light glowing all the time, to make day in the middle of night. And the mind works. And all of these become part of the mental life. Maybe even to support body, but eventually to support mind's ideals. And you see, the expression of music, for example, is one of the aspects of mental life. What in you enjoys the beauty of a melody? The body does not. The emotions only to the extent that they are mentalized. Otherwise they just feel good. They cannot create an expression which is a musical melody. And the complex nuances of a complex orchestra is an experience which is enjoyed entirely by mind. That is why you will see, to be able to fully appreciate the subtleties of a complex music, your body becomes quiet. You have to let your energies become quiet. And what remains is the mind awareness and the joy of the emotions, which are primarily mental, now appreciating and taking in the whole beauty of this experience. So we build a mental life. But what are you doing when you play the music? You feel something and you express that feeling into the music. I feel this rising movement of joy. How can I express it? I sing. But my singing is still too simple. The joy which I have is so much more complex. Can I now sing through many voices? Through many kinds of tones? And so the composer literally expresses himself through so many forms and in a complex melody. It's still soul expressing, working through nature. And then as this rises into the spiritual consciousness, the same consciousness awakening, experiencing itself one with everything, expresses itself now more completely. Now from the material through the mental through the spiritual, your power of expression has grown. The complexity of expression has grown. The range of influence has grown. In the spiritual, you feel yourself one with the whole universe. You empathize with beings who are on another planet and their struggles, and send from your heart a peace and a calm to help them support through their suffering, as much as you send the peace to someone right next to you. So the range of action has also grown. The physical life has only a narrow range and narrow means. Mental life much more, and the spiritual the highest. But always, we reread this sentence, all life, spiritual, mental or material, is the play of the soul with the possibilities of its nature. Always you were trying to fulfill what you are capable of expressing of yourself, of the soul, and its nature. For without this play, there can be no self-expression and no relative self-experience. If you are not projecting what you experience yourself to be into your nature and through your nature, you cannot express yourself. I feel wonderful delight, but no power of expression. The moment I express, through speech, through gesture, through forms, whatever, I am expressing in nature, through nature. And nature, of course, at first is offering a resistance. I have to work, train, shape, make plastic my nature so that I can freely express my joy in my music. Consider what you do when you train to play an instrument or to sing. If you tell someone untrained, can you sing your heart's joy? You will get something not too different from the joy that the donkey has when it's braying its joy. The range is so narrow. And then it starts working. It feels somehow this nature is restricting me, it's limiting, and it starts making it plastic, expanding its capacity and so on. Until when you listen to the developed musician, you forget that it is a human voice. At some point you begin to experience the character of the soul consciousness flowing into the voice. It lifts you, changes you, and awakens in you the experience of that person's consciousness. That's when the nature has become transparent, or only the carrier through which the soul experience touches your soul consciousness. But still, the nature is the means by which you're conveying, expressing, manifesting what you are. So, there can be no self-expression and no relative self-experience. Each one of us experiences a different relationship to this flower. You look at it and you have a different sense of past associations, a value of the object, different ways of relating to it. So the gardener says, well, I am going to sell this for so much. The artist says, oh, this is so beautiful, I would like to draw, I would like to paint. Somebody else says, this is how my heart feels and I want to offer myself before the divine. Different ways of relating. And so you have a different relative experience, meaning each one somehow perceives the same shared reality in a different way. And for that you need this nature through which each one of us feels itself different and separate as an individual, and yet the shared space of experience is nature. So, without this play there can be no self-expression and no relative self-experience. And he is highlighting now the place of nature in the individual and in importance of nature for the individual to have this shared relative experience or self-expression. We will come to the deep truth at the end of this paragraph that there is God, nature, and the individual. And these three are the most fundamental, let's say, reality for the purpose of this play. Everything else is dependent on the relationship between these three. Even then, in our in our realization of all as our larger self, and in our oneness with God and other beings, this play can and must persist unless we desire to cease from all self-expression and all but a tranced and absorbed self-experience. So what happens when you are expressing yourself? Yes, of course, there is this play. And when you grow into divine consciousness, as you grow into realization of one self, in which all selves are yourself, this play does not change. It only becomes more complete, more rich. Even when you enter oneness with God, I am one consciousness that exceeds space and time, but also inhabits all space and time. You still have this relationship and this play taking place through nature. Now perhaps even more complete. It does not end. But there's the possibility, you could say, you could choose to cease from all self-expression. Let's say you're a musician, you just sang your heart's joy because you were happy. It's spring, beautiful morning. Or you are now in this liberated consciousness where you experience the hearts of all beings, and now you sing the joy that you experience in all these hearts. And you see what a different experience it would be, a different expression. And now you feel yourself one with God, one with the one that is all, beyond space and time as well as within space and time. And you sing out this experience. What a different thing it would be. But one more possibility remains. I withdraw from all self-experience, from all self-expression. What happens then? And he says, unless we desire to cease from all self-expression and all but a tranced and absorbed self-experience, you would withdraw and withdraw. Where are you? You are in experience of yourself, withdrawn into trance. What happens then? But then it is in the individual being that this trance is. But then it is in the individual being that this trance or this liberated play is realized. I am now free from the whole world into my trance in the individual consciousness. I re-engage with the world, it is again from the individual consciousness. The trance is this mental being's immersion in the soul experience of unity. The liberated play is the taking up of his mind into the spiritual being for the free realization and delight of oneness. So he is now showing you what really happens in the trance state. You never really cease to be from the play. You withdrew from self-expression, entered into self-experience of your own individual consciousness. You are liberated, but in this liberation, you have only withdrawn your mind from experiencing separateness. And so the mind goes into a trance, the liberated consciousness is what it always was. And so we find a very deep insight now into what really happens in deeper states of consciousness. Looking at it from the human angle, you enter, let's say, a state of deep concentration in which you withdraw from the body, from the physical senses. You turn your attention to some diviner, deeper or higher state, and as you begin to merge into it, what is happening? The mind begins to go into a swoon, because the mind is an instrument of a divided consciousness. When it meets something which is indivisible, it cannot register it anymore. It feels a kind of a blurring. I feel as if I am no more conscious, and I feel as if my separateness of boundaries is fading out. I feel as if I will cease to be separate, and it goes into a kind of a swoon. But the consciousness continues in its oneness, and that is what you call trance. To the surface body, it looks like the fellow has gone into a kind of sleep. So someone from outside says, oh, this fellow is asleep. Someone else says, no, he is in deep trance of meditation in a divine state. How do you know? Can't make out. Of course, you can make out if you try to wake him up. So if you shout, if you slap the fellow, if he is in normal sleep, he will wake up, because the mind has just gone into partial sleep state and is pulled out of it by the shock. But if he has gone into deep trance, he won't come out so easily. You can thrash him up, the body may be in extreme injury, but it won't be enough to pull him out, because he has gone so deep and the mind is in such a deep swoon. So that would be one test to know. But you could equally say the fellow is dead. How do you know he has died or is in trance? This is in fact a practical problem for people who are used to going into such deep states, that they are on the borderline of complete withdrawal from the body. It was a guidance which was given by one of the Shankaracharyas who passed away some decades ago. And he said, if you ever find my heart has stopped, or you think I am dead, don't cremate the body. First you break 100 coconuts on the head, and if I still don't wake up, then you know that I have actually left the body. But 100 coconuts is a lot to whack somebody into wakefulness. But literally, when the consciousness is withdrawn, not just the mind, even the life force is withdrawn, all the physical functions slow down. It's normal for us in deep meditation that the breathing becomes almost nothing. Even the heart rate slows down. But if you were to withdraw even more from the physical consciousness, it could even appear to stop completely, but the body will not decay. This is another sign. If the thread of consciousness is still retained, the body does not decay even though it appears to be dead. And then it can re-enter, reanimate and activate, and everything is fine. Nothing is destroyed. Oxygen depletion did not take place, your cells did not die. Fascinating. Why? Because they were nourished by the life energy stream directly from inside, not needing external life energy through the form of oxygen. But what happened to the consciousness? The mind went into a swoon, was as if absorbed by immersion into the soul experience of unity. The liberated play is the taking up of his mind into the spiritual being for the free realization and delight of oneness. The same mind can now be taken up not in a swoon, but embraced in a consciousness of oneness for a free experience of the delight of oneness. You see the difference between the two. In one case, the mind is as if immersed in the unity and ceases to be functioning. In the other case, the mind is taken up and made a vehicle for the spiritual being, and now it becomes an instrument through which there is the free realization and delight of the oneness. The whole thing rests on how you relate to mind, and that will decide whether it is a withdrawal or it is a participation. The trance is the mental being's immersion in the soul experience of unity. The liberated play is the taking up of his mind into the spiritual being for the free realization and delight of oneness. For the nature of the divine existence is to possess always its unity, but to possess it also in the infinite experience, from many standpoints, on many planes, through many conscious powers or selves of itself, individualities, in our limited intellectual language, of the one conscious being. So we come to that beautiful image that the divine existence, the nature of the divine existence is always to possess its unity. The nature, remember, it is the consciousness of the divine existence, and the power of consciousness is always wanting to possess the unity. Whether it does it this way through the many forms, or it does this way from an inward withdrawal to embrace its own unity within, it's always seeking to possess its unity. But there are two movements. It can possess its unity by an inward withdrawal, or it can possess its unity in an infinite experience from many standpoints on many planes. Every viewpoint, every point, every pair, every ratio, every point of space, every pulsation of energy on every point of space is the one divine knowing himself as that point and relating to himself through that point. And that's how the whole universe comes to be. The very nature of the divine existence is to possess always its unity, but to possess it also in an infinite experience from many standpoints, on many planes. And this is still in the mental plane, or to some extent in the physical plane, and then there are still higher planes. The transcendental numbers would represent some aspect of the mental plane on a higher status, and then there would be things which are beyond numbers necessarily, on many planes, through many conscious powers or selves of itself. Just as this pi ratio is itself in an aspect, there are other such transcendental numbers, E, which is the base for natural logarithm, which is an aspect of itself. It appears in certain ratios and relationships. Powers or selves of itself. Every power of itself is a self of itself. The power to become reddish pink is also an aspect of itself. It is itself as reddish pink. To become yellow is divine as vibration of yellowness. To become all the fine nuances of all the colors is the divine as itself, as a power. But as a power, it is not bound to a location. It is everywhere in these colors and the range of colors possible. As a quality of emotion, of joy, of longing, of sorrow, or any of the ranges of emotions, it is a power of consciousness. It is itself the divine itself as power or self of itself. Now when you think of it in this way, everything is the divine entering in relation to itself in these multiplicities. And within that, each of these points, so to say, is an individuality. But we give special importance to this individuality which is formed, that we call I, which is a special view of the divine, now awakening to become mentally conscious. What is the individuality of the flower? It is also divine awakening now to become living form, but not mentally conscious. What is the individuality of the atom? It is still the divine, now form, but not conscious, not expressive of its life or power of consciousness, simply holding itself in a quality or bundle of form of energy. And if you go down further, there is no stability of form. Subatomic particles appear and disappear and change as if fluid waves in the ocean of consciousness of energy, in the play of delight of consciousness and energy. But they're still each of them facets of the divine consciousness. Out of all that, it's as if the individuality has become highlighted more and more, and the more complex it is formed, the more narrow and defined and separate it appears. So given the physical space of this room, every atom is an individuality, every object is an individuality, but the number of human beings which are conscious in mental individuality is much smaller. And then number of beings which are conscious in mental individuality, with or without body, may be slightly larger. But still, it would be a finite number perhaps, because there are invisible beings equally. And they would all be doing their own thing or interested in their own way, but they are finite in a limited space. So for the universe, there's a huge amount of effort put to build a highly developed individual point in which the full experience of awakening to divinity is possible. And so necessarily numbers are more sparse, less of such individuals, many more of the individuality of bacteria, for example, or of atoms. So All of these he is describing on many planes, many standpoints, through many conscious powers or selves of itself, individualities in our limited intellectual language of the one conscious being. Now you understand why he uses this phrase in our limited intellectual language. Because finally, what is this individual? It is himself. It's never really separate. And each of our individualities taking its own unique journey is himself taking that unique journey at the same time. Because he is outside and beyond time. We entering the experience of time, we say, but this is different because it is following a parallel journey at the same time as me. It cannot be me. But if you live outside time, then you can flow through time this way, flow through time that way, flow in another way, but it is still you. You re-enter time and you see these as separate yous. You see the difference? It's all a question of perspective. So our limited intellectual language has to say individuality of the one conscious being. Each one of us is one of these individualities. Now what happens when we know ourselves as that, or when we don't know ourselves as that? To stand away from God in limited ego, limited mind, is to stand away from ourselves. The moment you take on that position that I am now this limited ego, I am now this limited mind, you have separated yourself from your own true individuality, which is one with the divine. Is to stand away from ourselves, to be unpossessed of our true individuality, to be the apparent and not the real individual. It is our power of ignorance. Very interesting idea. We have a power to limit ourselves and to stand separate from ourselves, to not be anymore the real individual, to put up a form. That power of ourselves is our power of ignorance. And we'll go back to the analogy we used earlier. You want to meet the fish in the water, you put your hand in the water. It is your power to project your consciousness in a limited way that the fish can meet. And you can play with the fish, give it food, withdraw it. But you also have the power to fully enter and be with the fish, entirely yourself. The fish may not register your entirety. It may still look at your face or your hand and see them as separate things. Interesting, isn't it? The fish comes to your hand, it comes to your face, it thinks they are different people. It looks at your fingers, it thinks each finger is a different person. But you are fully there. It cannot comprehend the totality of your being because that is its limited ego consciousness. But the power to project a limited part of yourself, to stand away from yourself, is your power of ignorance. To be taken up into the divine being and to be aware of our spiritual, infinite and universal consciousness as that in which we now live is to possess our supreme and integral self, our true individuality. It is our power of self-knowledge. Fascinating. We have a power of ignorance. We have a power of self-knowledge. They're two different powers. One power highlights separateness and limitation. Another power recovers oneness and completeness. They as if go in two different directions. In the Vedic vocabulary, both powers are given the name avidya and vidya. Vidya is the power of recovering oneness and completeness. And avidya is the power of concentrating to limit and separate. But you see, the two are really one power, taking different directions. That's why there are not two different words for the two powers. There is only Vidya and then the opposite direction of Vidya, which is avidya. Separation from Vidya. They are not two different words. The Sanskrit is a very mystical language. The word has to convey the truth of what it represents. So there is only one power of consciousness. It can move away from oneness into multiplicity, or it can move towards oneness. Avidya and Vidya. Sri Aurobindo in his commentary on the Isha Upanishad dwells on this in great detail. Here he only leads you to this glimpse from the perspective of Sachidananda's unity and in the context of soul and nature and the three, divine, individual and nature. You see how these two powers are really our powers of the liberated consciousness. And it can choose to enter into ignorance, to experience limitation. It can also choose to move into oneness and recover knowledge. So Sri Aurobindo explains in his commentary on the Isha Upanishad that avidya is described as ignorance because it is the power by which one can enter into the experience of ignorance. But in itself, it doesn't mean ignorance. It is the power to emphasize multiplicity. Taken to its culmination, the multiplicity ends up with a sense of completely separate peace as an individual, and that is ignorance. Equally, the power of oneness is what brings you back to your completeness, and therefore it is a power of knowledge. So it is Vidya he describes as the consciousness or power of unity, and avidya as the consciousness or power of multiplicity. Now when you see them as these, there's no negative sense to it. It is only when taken to extreme that you have the loss of the other truth, and therefore an error. The Isha Upanishad therefore even elucidates on this truth. It says that if you continue after the power of avidya, the sense of multiplicity, and chase only after it, then you are lost in darkness. But on the other hand, if you chase only after the power of unity, you are lost in a greater darkness. And for commentators, it is strange because you are being told that if you lose yourself in the oneness of the divine, you are lost in a greater darkness than if you lose yourself in multiplicity of the world or matter or ego. And Sri Aurobindo explains this. He says, when you lose yourself into multiplicity or ignorance or ego, life will kick you into awakening. He uses much more refined language, but life basically punches you and forces you to recognize that you are not separate. It compels you to re-engage. You cannot live in isolation. At the very least, you have to eat or breathe or engage with human beings in some way or other. So it brings you back eventually to the recognition of some deeper unity. But if you lose yourself into the oneness of the divine, there is nothing in the divine to force you back into multiplicity. And you can end up with the partial realization of the divine as only one and a monotone of oneness, not knowing anymore the multiplicity or the delight of the multiplicity. And you will never know it then, because you chose to know the divine only in its one-sided truth. And this was the basis of the whole ascetic approach to life, which saw the divine only in oneness and not in the multiplicity, and therefore the error of withdrawal from life. So this description which he gives of these two powers of consciousness is something extremely important. For the purpose of the integral yoga, both powers are to be realized and both to be utilized in a free play. And for the purpose of the play, you may exercise the power of multiplicity and modulate or move back and forth between the power of unity and multiplicity, or live in both in a complex play of delight. So I'm going to reread these two sentences for the value that they have for this understanding. To stand away from God in limited ego, limited mind, is to stand away from ourselves, to be unpossessed of our true individuality, to be the apparent and not the real individual. It is our power of ignorance. Now you're stuck in the appearance and the reality is hidden. To be taken up into the divine being and be aware of our spiritual, not mental, infinite, not finite as in mind, and universal consciousness, not ego consciousness. To be aware of our spiritual, infinite and universal consciousness as that in which we now live is to possess our supreme and integral self, our true individuality. It is our power of self-knowledge. Now, the yoga really is increasing the power of self-knowledge. And the habit of egoistic mind is to remain bound in the power of ignorance by habit. If you think about it, if the habit was not there strong enough, we would simply slide back into the oneness, because that is such an overwhelming truth of reality. Everything is sustained by oneness. Everything is relating to oneness. Every event happening is possible because the oneness holds it all together. And if there was not a very strong fixation in limitation or in division or in ego, we would not be able to hold individuality easily. And it is here that you find the justification for the rigidity of the ego consciousness or the nature of the struggle of awakening out of matter. First, the divine built a firm base in complete self-division, in what we call inconscience. Total loss of consciousness, total loss of any sense of existence. Barren, empty space is all you see. Fluctuating energies. That's the physics in which the world starts. And then out of that slowly emerges matter. And because it's emerging out of this extreme opposite, the matter has this dullness, inertia, unconsciousness, rigidity. And out of that, bit by bit, as life and mind evolve, the sense of the inertia and rigidity and dullness of matter is what keeps the hard form. So that you don't very quickly lapse back into that which is so much more plastic and fluid and free. It keeps you bound and tied. And you understand why matter resists the awakening of the spiritual consciousness. Because it serves the purpose of keeping the individual and the base here in form. Because the goal of Satchidananda in the multiplicity of the play is to manifest through form. And to have the play possible through sustaining form. I'm not using the word rigid anymore, because the form has to become plastic, but it must be able to sustain as form to be able to have any meaningful play. So rigidity is the way by which it keeps the sustaining character of the form in the beginning. But as the consciousness awakens more and more, it looks at this form and tries to make it more and more plastic, more and more conscious, until with a divine consciousness, it becomes divinely plastic and expressive of the Satchidananda's delight and beauty and joy and love and knowledge and power, but now in a sustaining form, in a transformed or divinized body, which can now experience a divine life in form, sustained in a material world. To have the divine life in the spiritual worlds is already there. It's not here. And that's the whole point of this exercise of building it here. And here is when you have the miracle. That which is free of form and infinite appears here in form as finite, and yet revealing infinity of its delight and beauty and love and knowledge and power through finite appearance of form. And such a form would be so extraordinarily beautiful, because at every moment it would reveal its newness and its ananda, its delight. And the form has to become plastic enough to be able to constantly be fresh and new in its beauty. And even the most beautiful flower or the most beautiful face of purity is nothing compared to that glow of Satchidananda when matter itself becomes divine Ananda. And we get a glimpse of that when we experience the nature of the psychic being and the psychic personality. That is the part of us in which we experience divine in and as form, to whatever extent it has evolved. And that's why Mother spoke of the psychic being materializing to become literally the substance of the body. That would be the basis on which the supramental body would be expressed in the world. So we've gone beyond the scope of what is being discussed here, but you understand the importance of what is being discussed when you look at the larger goal of the evolution. To be taken up into the divine being, no more separate, and be aware of our spiritual, infinite and universal consciousness as that in which we now live, is to possess our supreme and integral self, our true individuality. And each person thus is an individuality of Satchidananda. It is our power of self-knowledge. And in the next paragraph, which we will take up next Friday, he says, by knowing the eternal unity of these three powers of the eternal manifestation, God, nature and the individual self, and their intimate necessity to each other, we come to understand existence itself and all that in the appearance of the world now puzzles our ignorance. If you understand the true relationship between these three and why each one needs the other, their intimate necessity, then no more it appears a puzzle. And what we did in our study of this last paragraph was we constantly brought it back to this perspective. We saw the relationship of these three, and now in this last part of the discussion, the fulfillment of these three. In the individual, the whole universal finds its fulfillment in the divinization of nature, of the universe itself. For the divine, the individual is the focal point through which the experience of the divine delight in the play is possible. For the individual, the divine is itself, and nature is the playground upon which it can experience multiplicity of itself. Now you see why the three are needed, and the three are intimately bound to each other. Take out one and you cannot have this delight of the play of multiplicity. So by knowing the eternal unity of these three powers, they can never be separated. If you have one, you will eventually end up with the other two. Even if they are concealed, they are always there. So they are always united, they are always eternally present as three principles, but always one which appear as three. By knowing the eternal unity of these three powers of the eternal manifestation, God, nature and the individual self, and their intimate necessity to each other, we come to understand existence itself and all that in the appearance of the world now puzzles our ignorance. The puzzle is only as long as you have that ignorance, you do not see this underlying oneness and the play of these three. In the Christian tradition, the original sense of the Trinity was these three. There is God, there is man, and then there is the Holy Spirit. In the more obvious vocabulary of the yoga, there is the transcendent, there is the universal, and then there is the individual. And Sri Aurobindo even describes the cross as representing that originally, the individual consciousness meeting the universal, but also connecting to the transcendent above. That was the original sense of the cross. And he says that it is only in a later declining form that it became the symbol of suffering rather than the symbol of liberation or even a divinization. So there are many such ancient symbols which unfortunately over time have become either lost or corrupted or even perverted. If we know them for what they truly represent, we recognize what those ancients glimpsed and the truth they tried to articulate, which at that stage of human development was perhaps too high to be captured in its purity. And so it was only distorted glimpses that the various religions or traditions could catch. And every time they needed to be regenerated to bring them closer to the truth, and again declining because that's all that was humanly possible. And we are now at that stage in the evolution where we have come up to that point where we can actually glimpse it in its deeper sense, in our higher parts of the mind and heart. And if we can glimpse it, then we can now grow into its image. And we can begin to live more and more in that truth. And if even a few in humanity are able to glimpse and begin to live in that truth, well, numbers don't matter. The entire universe is impacted. Not only the earth, the entire universe. And for those of us who are called to this aspiration, who feel the need for this truth to be lived, to be realized, to whatever degree we are able to, even if it is in our very limited higher parts of consciousness. For those of us who are called to this, it is the most precious gift that we could have, to have the joy of participating in this awakening and in this great evolutionary leap that the whole universe and evolution has been preparing for across billions of years. And we are at that point of transition where it can actually be realized here and now in this life, to whatever extent. And so that makes this life so valuable, so special. We can perhaps pause with this, meditate on this theme, hold this vision or this aspiration as we chant Om together. We'll continue next Friday. Oh.